Thank you, Dr. Schumacher. If we were in Holland, we would say congratulations, gefeliciteerd to all of you, because it's Europe's birthday today, and that's what you do in Holland. You congratulate everybody because it's your birthday, even though it had nothing to do with her birthday. And probably none of us had anything to do with the birth of the European Union or the movement that has led to the European Union. In 1985, in the Council of Milan, it was decided that this day, the 9th of May, would be set aside as Europe Day. It's one of Europe's best kept secrets, though. I think you can go right through school and never learn about these things, and never learn about the story that I'd like to share with you today. And so we're talking about Europe's forgotten birthday, and to understand what this was all about, we need to go back to the end of the Second World War, May 1945. In various countries across Europe, there's been celebrations remembering the end of that war. Just as May the 5th in Holland was the Liberation Day. And of course, we're familiar with all these scenes of the jubilation that took place, the soldiers coming through the liberated towns, and the soldiers kissing the girls, giving out chocolate and so forth. And we all know, yes, how the war was won. But do we stop to think about how the peace was won? It seems as if, well, after all the girls have been kissed, the chocolates have been given out. And here we have such a scenario. Everybody went back home and lived happily ever after, got back to life as normal. Was that really the case? No, that was not the case. Europe was suffering a major case of post-trauma stress disorder. And all across Europe, lives had been so totally disrupted, and there was great emotional and physical wound. Lives had been destroyed and uprooted, disorientated. Families had been broken. There were physical wounds and spiritual wounds and emotional wounds. Cities and nations had been torn asunder, and there were deep, bitter hatreds and mistrust. And we must not gloss over that post-war phase, because, as we all know, cities like Dresden, photographed here, or Coventry or Rotterdam, had been so destroyed by enemy bombs. And the big question was, at the end of the war, how could Europe be rebuilt? On what social, on what political vision could Europe be rebuilt? The end of the Second World War saw a new world order coming in. Here we have the Yalta III, and it was representing really a transfer from British dominance to American dominance, not just American dominance, but of course a bipolar world there. Uncle Joe, who was making all sorts of promises there, that President Roosevelt believed. It was just a short time before Winston Churchill was saying, as in this series of photos here, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. So it was just a few short years after the end of the Second World War that this iron curtain fell across Europe, and Uncle Joe's true intentions became evident. And the Berlin airlift took place, and as my experience, very few young people even are aware of what took place during the Berlin airlift, as the planes had to line up on the tarmac, taking off every minute or so to rescue the besieged people there in Berlin. The war may have been won, but who was going to win the peace? We forget too the turmoil that was taking place in countries like Italy, in France, in the Ruhr Valley as well, as the Kremlin were influencing the trade unions to have a throttle-hold grip on the fledgling democratic governments of those nations as they were trying to find their way to some kind of stability there. France was torn by strikes. And this is what now introduces us to the story of Robert Schuman. The name Robert Schuman conjures up in most people's minds a musician. That is Schumann with two N's. That is also a German composer from the 19th century, not to be confused with this man who actually had to change his nationality 5 times in his life because of the fortunes of war, as the borders kept moving down through the Rhine Valley area. And so it was Robert Schumann, who was born in Luxembourg, who was educated in Germany, found himself drafted into the German army in the First World War. He failed his medical and he ended up doing clerical work. After that war, however, he was now part of France, Alsace-Lorraine. And he was a lawyer, and he was actually commissioned to harmonize the laws between the laws that existed in what used to be the German territory, now into the French law. And in fact, the work that he did then was to safeguard many of the certain freedoms in the Alsace-Lorraine area, so that even today, the principle of laïcité that is applied to most of France is not applied in that area because of what is called Rex Schumann, the law of Schumann. In this post-World War I era, this was his contribution. And he found himself in the French Parliament in that interwar area, and he was a very devout Catholic. He has been called almost monkish. He considered going into the priesthood, but one of his friends advised him to be a priest in Mufti, and to be a priest in the secular world. When the German troops invaded France, Robert Schumann was the first French member of Parliament who was arrested and who was put in solitary confinement for 7 months. Now, as a man of prayer, that was not perhaps as great a hardship as may have been for others. He learned to draw strength in his own relationship with God. After 7 months, the Gestapo changed their track. They changed their strategies, and they tried to woo him. They wanted him to write articles on their behalf, and so that it would be seen that he was now supporting them, which he refused to do. But he was given more freedom. He was under house arrest. He was able to do research, and as a trained statistician, he had worked out there by the 1942 that the Germans had to lose the war. They could not sustain this effort. He also learned from his Gestapo interrogators, who boasted to them of what they were doing to the Jews. He learned things that the leaders in the West had not yet heard about the final solution. And so he resolved he had to escape. He had to get this information out to the West. And so he made a bold escape, dressed as a woman, and he went from cloister to cloister through 700 kilometers of enemy territory with a price of 100,000 Reichmark on his head, and eventually found himself into the southern free zone of France, where he made contact with the government there and passed on this information. Charles de Gaulle was in exile in England at the time and invited him to come and join the government there. But Schumann did not want to ally himself with de Gaulle's style of nationalism and chose to stay in France, went into hiding, and there began to prepare for the end that he knew sooner or later had to come. And so he began to think through now what kind of government, what kind of new order needed to be set up after the war in Europe to prevent the ongoing repetition of France and Germany constantly going to war with each other. His options that he tried to weigh up were how to break the cycle of vengeance and violence. A new order was needed, a new order that was unprecedented in history. The old order had been there since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, where competing nation-states arranged themselves in various alliances to have a balance of power, but these alliances had led to a system that had produced 2 world wars. Nationalism, he felt, had failed. It had either been too strong in the case of Germany or too weak in the case of France. The Holocaust, of course, had challenged many people's faith in God. Many others had lost their faith in humankind. Schumann, however, had lost neither. and his personal faith played a major role in his politics, although not always overtly. As far as he was concerned, the roots of true democracy, the principle of equality, the practice of brotherly love, individual freedom, respect for the rights of the individual, all came from the teachings of Jesus Christ. Democracy will either be Christian or it will not be, he wrote. An anti-Christian democracy will be a parody which will sink into tyranny or into anarchy. True democracy required servanthood, serving the people, acting in agreement with the people. The goals had to start with peace, and the means had to be works of peace. Loving your neighbour as yourself was a democratic principle, he said, which applied to nations meant being prepared to serve and love neighbouring peoples. Can you imagine how radical that kind of talk was in the bitter aftertaste of the Second World War? What did that mean in international politics regarding the French and the Germans who had been habitual enemies? If Christianity taught that children of the same God, regardless of race, colour, social status or profession, states too should be treated as equals. The universal law of love and charity made every man our neighbour, he continued, and social relations in the Christian world have been based on this ever since. No race or nation, therefore, could claim greater importance in God's eyes. Now, this contradicted directly the nationalism, for example, of de Gaulle. Solidarity, subsidiarity, and equality were therefore all values based on Christ's teaching, in Schumann's view. So applied to the community of peoples, forgiveness and reconciliation, even with those who were presently seen as the enemy, were Christian imperatives. And so for Schumann, a future united Europe naturally had to be both Christian and democratic. The European story was deeply rooted in the Christian story. And once cut off from these roots, Europe would lose the foundations for equality, for human dignity, for tolerance, and for compassion. Europe, he came to see, had to become a community of peoples, deeply rooted in basic Christian values. Now, it was while Robert Schuman was Prime Minister of France for a brief season of a few months in 1948. He was riding on a train and he met an industrialist who began to tell him about a place in Switzerland, a place called Caux, high up above Montreux, on the eastern end of Lac Léman, or Lake Geneva, which had been turned by a movement of Christians into a centre for the reconciliation of the nations. And he heard, to his amazement, how trade unionists were attending conferences there, and they came back with a new spirit of reconciliation, a new spirit of cooperation to Labour-government clashes in northern France, in Lille, around the coal mining area. And he later learned that in this place, and here we see the magnificent view from this place up in Caux, looking out towards Geneva along the lake there, that in the few years after, following the Second World War, 1946 to 1950, over 3,000 Germans took part in these meetings in Caux of the Moral Rearmament movement, whose leader was Frank Buchmann. There were government members, trade unionists, industrialists, there were clergy, there were media representatives, there were educationalists, and there were at least 11 members of the Konrad Adenauer family there. And so Robert Schuman was very keen to meet this man, Frank Buchmann, the leader of this movement, who was a Lutheran pastor from America, but with German roots. And so it was arranged that he could have a private meeting with him in France. And in that meeting, Schuman confessed that he was very tempted to give up politics. He was discouraged with what was going on. He was facing the opposition from the trade unions and the communist members of parliament who were calling him all sorts of names, Nazi sympathizer and so forth, in the parliament meetings themselves. There were times where there was a great uproar in the parliament, and Robert Schuman would quietly stop and pray to recover his composure before he made his responses. And eventually, as he met with Frank Buchmann over a meal, he says, "I don't know who to trust in the new Germany." And Frank Buchmann said, "We have some excellent men in Co. and mentioned the name there of Konrad Adenauer. It was at that stage where Schumann said that he wanted to perhaps give up and retire and live in a cloister and write books. And he said, "What do you advise me to do?" And Frank Wittmann said, "What does your heart tell you to do?" Schumann said, "I knew you'd say something like that." "I know," he said, "my job is not yet finished. I need to work towards the reconciliation of these nations." And so it was that he met Konrad Adenauer. It wasn't always very easy. There was the problem of the Saar area. But in a short time, these two men became very close confidants. And it was because of the trust relationship that developed between these two men, nurtured by Frank Wittmann, that these two men were prepared to enter into a very bold experiment with the support of Alcide de Gasperi, the Catholic Prime Minister of Italy. And so it was that eventually Konrad Adenauer made this comment to Robert Schumann as they were prepared to move towards the formation of the European Coal and Steel Community. And he says, "I consider it to be a providential sign that it is men like you, de Gasperi, and myself, who are filled with the desire to build the new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations." In fact, as these three men eventually traveled to Paris in 1951 to officially put their signatures under the contract, under the treaty of the European Coal and Steel Community, they stopped on their way at a monastery on the Rhine River for a prayer retreat that weekend before continuing on to Paris to eventually sign that treaty. Now, it's a complicated story. I've told it in more detail in this book called Deeply Rooted. And I must say, it was a personal discovery for me to begin to find out more about Robert Schumann and to be amazed at the lack of literature in English on this man's story. My sons all have university degrees, never came across his story in their education. A little while ago, I was speaking to some university students from Holland and Belgium about this. At the end of the story, their first response was, "Why haven't we heard this before?" And the teachers were standing down the back, and I said, "I'm afraid you have to ask this gentleman there." It is amazing, as I say, Europe's best kept secret. It is amazing to me that we do not hear more about this. Now, so it was on the 9th of May 1950 that Robert Schumann surprised not only his own cabinet and Prime Minister, but they surprised the world with the announcement of the European Coal and Steel Community. It only took him 3 minutes to read the following statement, so we're going to take these 3 minutes. We still have some time to do so. And I think for most of us, it will be the first time we've actually read through the Schumann Declaration. But I want us to realize this. Within those 3 minutes, Robert Schumann laid a foundation for the European house in which today 500 million Europeans from 27 nations live together in peace. And this was the starting point. This was the starting moment. It was a surprise to the world, as you see in this headline here. Robert Schumann, circled in red there, read out this statement, which I'm going to read. The world peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. The contribution which an organized and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations. In taking upon itself for more than 20 years the role of champion of a united Europe, France has always had as her essential aim the service of peace. A united Europe was not achieved, and we had war. Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. The coming together of the nations of Europe requires the elimination of the age-old opposition of France and Germany. Any action taken must in the first place concern these two nations. With this aim in view, the French government proposes that action be taken immediately on one limited but decisive point. It proposes that Franco-German production of coal and steel as a whole be placed under a common high authority within the framework of an organization open to the participation of the other countries of Europe. The pooling of coal and steel production should immediately provide for the setting up of common foundations for economic development as a first step in the Federation of Europe, and will change the destinies of those regions which have long been devoted to the manufacture of munitions of war, of which they have been the most constant victims. The solidarity in production thus established will make it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The setting up of this powerful productive unit, open to all countries willing to take part, and bound ultimately to provide all the member countries with the basic elements of industrial production on the same terms, will lay a true foundation for their economic unification. This production will be offered to the world as a whole, without distinction or exception, and with the aim of contributing to raising living standards and to promoting peaceful achievements. With increased resources, Europe will be able to pursue the achievement of one of its essential tasks, listen to this, namely the development of the African continent. In the 3 minutes that he had time to talk about Europe's responsibility to another continent. In this way, there will be realized simply and specially that fusion of interests, which is indispensable to the establishment of a common economic system. It may be the leaven from which may grow a wider and deeper community between countries long opposed to one another by sanguinary opposition. That by the pooling basic production, by instituting a new high authority whose decisions will bind France, Germany, and other member countries, this proposal will lead to the realization of the first concrete foundation of a European Federation, indispensable to the preservation of peace. Now, that was on the evening of the 9th of May 1950. On the other side of the world at that moment, it was already the 10th of May. A new day had dawned there. And there was a young mother was changing the dirty diapers of an 8-month-old son. And in the time that she took to change those diapers, which happened to be mine, Robert Schuman had made a statement that I believe really ought to be recognized as the defining moment of post-war Europe. More so than the collapse of the Berlin Wall, because the collapse of the Berlin Wall happened because this had already taken place. Thank you very much.